I would like to begin simply by saying, welcome, Christian. It's always a good Sunday. I've said when I end it with a wet sleeve, it's a good Sunday when I start it with a wet sleeve as well. When you choose to take a trip, you have a few options, maybe even many options. It is said that every journey begins with a first step. And that is true no matter which method of transit you use. Whether it's a first step on a walk across country or out the door to your car. Your first step may take you towards an airplane, a train, a bus, a camel, a horse, piggyback if you have a really good friend, or perhaps even a boat. We read of such a journey in a boat, and it was certainly a unique journey for at least a couple of reasons. Even though it was not a particularly long trip, the first part of it was somewhat arduous, while the second half was unlike any of before or since. The account is in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke does not contain any mention of this particular journey. Each of the 3 that do have the story within, and each has some element that's not in the other 2. The variations are minor, not at all contradictory, and more than anything else, just merely reflect differences in observation. Now, we will read from Matthew's account, as it has the most detailed of the recordings. Matthew chapter 14, beginning at verse 22. Matthew wrote, "And straightway he constrained the disciples to enter into the boat and to go before him unto the other side, till he should send the multitudes away. And after he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into the mountain apart to pray. And when even was come, he was there alone. But the boat was now in the midst of the sea, distressed by waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking upon the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying it's a ghost, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spoke to them and said, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be you, bid me to come to you upon the waters. And he said, Come on. And Peter went down from the boat and walked upon the waters to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and took hold of him and said to him, O you of little faith, wherefore did you doubt? And then when they were gone up into the boat, the wind ceased. And they that were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Of truth, you are the Son of God. And when they had crossed over, you are the Son of God. And when they had crossed over, they came to the land unto Gennesaret. This is the American Standard Version rendering. So, of course, the most stunning and obvious aspect of this story is Jesus walking on the water, which is an element that does not usually lend itself to properties of strong support nor acceptable traction. So why did Jesus choose this method of travel? Was it simply deified grandstanding? Well, to cause some thought on the subject, or this aspect of the subject, let's look at two other occasions when Jesus also confounded people with his actions. In John chapter 8, at verse 59, Jesus had just laid claim to being the Son of God, which the Jews understood to mean and require equality with God. And the only ones who can do that are, in fact, God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, this verse describes something peculiar, to say the least, and it's caused some controversy amongst commentaries. But the passage says that upon this statement of Jesus, those who heard him took up stones to cast at him. But he hid himself, and going through them, he passed by. Now, should someone make a claim to be God when they obviously were not, this was considered under the Old Covenant law to be blasphemy. And blasphemy was punishable by stoning. And as you might well assume, stoning most often ended in someone who was dead. So Jesus here had been repeatedly performing works outside of natural physical law. And in so doing, he proved himself to be master over natural physical law, thus proving his deity, his sonship, and his authority as God. Now, in this case, John seems to be describing Jesus using his mastery of physical law to cause those threatening him to not see him, as the term used is, he passed by. And some versions say that he went out from among them. In any case, he was able to simply walk away from this threat of death. Now, the second event I want to consider here is also in John chapter 11. And this is when Jesus raised Lazarus from the tomb. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, when Jesus hears about the death of his friend Lazarus, he said to his disciples then, "This sickness is not for death, or not unto death, but for the glory of God." Now, in making this statement, Jesus declares that there was a purpose for the death of Lazarus, and that purpose was not simply because he was sick. Rather, it was for a higher purpose. His statement is fulfilled in verses 41 and 42. When Jesus had traveled and was at the tomb with the relatives, family, friends of Lazarus, we're told Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. But I knew that you always hear me nevertheless, because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." So from this, we understand that the death and resurrection of this friend of Jesus was in order to stand as a solid and undeniable testimony to the sonship and deity of Jesus. So we take these two events and consider Jesus walking on the water in light of them. And we can recognize two things. One, Jesus did not have to walk on the water. He could have, for lack of a better term, simply made himself where he wanted to be. as in John 8. Additionally, in this action, he gave a most astonishing, a most even stupefying and convicting testimony to the reality of who and what he is as the Son of God. Emmanuel, God with us. As no one ever before or since has ever demonstrated such absolute command over wind and wave. In fact, Mark phrases it this way, and he went up unto them into the boat, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves, for they understood not concerning the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Have you ever really noticed that phrase before? Jesus did what he did, the way he did it, to prove once again to his disciples his true personage. Consider what Mark wrote in verse 52. For they understood not concerning the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Well, these are his disciples. These are the men who've been traveling all around with him, seeing him do all these wonderful things. In fact, they had just seen him feed 5,000 people. And while we often discuss the fact that the disciples of Jesus didn't fully comprehend what Jesus was teaching him, both in what he spoke and how he acted, Mark puts a much stronger context around this misunderstanding of the disciples. They had just observed his authority that Jesus exercised over physical quantity. When he fed the 5,000, actually more than 5,000, we're told it was just 5,000 men. Chances are there were some women and kids along. But he did that with just a small lunch. And when he was done, he had more leftovers than what he started with. Now give that action some thought. You go to McDonald's and you eat your Big Mac, and when you're finished, you have 3 more. I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse, but be that as it may. Truly, this was an event that causes the mind to boggle. It is common in the arena of public debate to establish point after point, fact after fact, until arriving at an inescapable conclusion. This is what Jesus was doing when he approached his disciples, they in their boat, he on open water. As he once again, over and over again, established point after point, fact after fact, until they had no choice but to arrive at the inescapable conclusion of a truth: you are the Son of God. Yes, Jesus could have crossed from shore to shore by any method we can perceive, and many, many that we cannot. But there was a method. There was a mission to his method. He was persuading his disciples of his true and complete nature as Emmanuel, God with us. His action upon the water was not brag. It was just a fact. A fact his disciples needed to have driven home past their hardened hearts. On the other hand, it's easy for us to understand their fear as he approached the boat in the dark, in the storm, and the passage says they thought he was a ghost. Well, after all, isn't it, as we've seen, a common, it isn't rather, as we've seen, a common thing for folks to walk on the water then or now. In fact, there's been multiple inventors who've tried to devise things that let people walk on water. I saw one guy had these, and they were even bigger than my shoes. They're these pontoon shoes to put on your feet. And well, that's fine if you're standing still. I don't know what happens when you lean, other than you get very wet. But we consider that Jesus was walking on the water. And it's only recorded in Matthew that Peter says, "If it is you, Lord." Jesus, rather, scholars say that Peter wasn't if it was really Jesus, but rather more along the lines of asking, "Are you a ghost or are you for real?" Well, my education is not of a caliber to question the experts, but Peter was certainly doubting something. And so his follow-on request, "Bid me come to you out on the water." Whereupon Jesus said to him, "Come ahead on." Now, this is really kind of an interesting discourse, as at least two aspects are at work here. One, Jesus had no doubt, no question about who he is, what authority he has, nor of his capabilities and capacities. And, being the creator and all of that. So walking on the water is just a snap. Allowing Peter to do the same is no more of a challenge for him than him doing it himself. But Peter had the same problem that we read about Thomas having later. He doubted. And as his faith weakened and waned, we're told he began to sink. And I know I've commented on this before, but I have trouble getting past this concept. How do you start to sink? I have a swimming pool. And one time I took a misstep and I fell in the pool. I didn't start to sink. I went down like a stone. So I'm not sure how to perceive this idea of Peter beginning to sink. But that's what we're told he did. When Jesus took Peter's hand, a physical connection was reestablished for Peter. Didn't matter to Jesus. His power wasn't limited one way or the other, but it mattered to Peter. When Jesus took Peter's hand, he was reconfidented, if that's a word. I guess I can make up words. And so here we have the juxtaposition of faith and sight. You may have faith as you sit here that your car will be in the parking lot when we walk out of here. When we get out there and you observe your car there, you will no longer have faith that it is there. You'll have the sight. Peter, at this point in his life, needed that physical reassurance. When he received it, he and Jesus walked to the boat and climbed in. Now, here is where Jesus puts an indisputable argument on the table. Just as he did at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, he took action which demonstrated his power, his authority, his personage. It demonstrated his care and his concern. And this is a great big and, he demonstrated approval of himself and his actions by God the Father, the God which these good Jewish boys were familiar with. Jesus told the wind and the waves to stop. And they did. The disciples reached the only possible conclusion they could have. Truly, you are the Son of God. Well, great story, you may say. But I haven't seen anything like this recently, so what does it hold for me? It does indeed have a lesson, or two or three for us, but it comes down to the two opposing attitudes experienced by Peter, faith and sight. There's a song that's based on this account, and it's simply entitled Oceans. I want you to listen closely to some of the lyrics of this song, Oceans. It's kind of a subtitle of Where Feet May Fail. This is what the lyricist wrote. You call me out upon the waters, the great unknown, where feet may fail. And there I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep. My faith will stand, and I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide. Where feet may fail and fear surrounds me, you've never failed, and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours and you are mine. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters, wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Now, the scriptures give us account of an amazing event. I mean, there's no other way to describe it as an amazing and astonishing event. And like much of scripture, people will discount it or even outright delete it. But it is there for us for a reason. There are those who would say, oh, if only I could have walked with Jesus, my faith would be so much stronger. To have walked down the path right beside him, hearing him speak, seeing him do miracles. But that sentiment flies directly in the face of the reason for passages such as this. Peter had been walking like that. Peter had been observing all the things that Jesus was doing. Peter was the one who said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yet, his faith faltered. In John chapter 20 at verse 29, Jesus said to them, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. We talked about this in class this morning. God is described in 1 Timothy as being invisible. Well, what do we think of things that are invisible? There's air around us. Can't see it, know it's there. Breathe it, keeps us alive. Sometimes it gets real nasty and blows things off the face of the earth, called hurricanes, tornadoes. We know that what Peter had was faith. We know that his faith at this point was based on sight. He, like the other disciples, underwent a drastic, intense, and immense change after the resurrection. But at this point, Peter was running on contact more than on faith. Which asks the question, then where are we here today? The song Oceans makes a declaration. And that declaration is, Lord, when you call me out upon uncertain waters, I'll go. No matter how strong the tide, no matter how blustery the wind, no matter how deep the sea, or how high tossing the waves, I will hold to you. Many of us have been called to go into those uncertain seas and have, through strength in Jesus, prevailed, some for many years. But there is no guarantee that such a challenge to your faith will not happen again and again and again. There are those who have never taken that first step to begin the voyage. Christian started his voyage this morning. So when Jesus calls you out onto the deep water, out of the boat, away from the land, what will your answer be? Will you be willing to set sail without a boat, without a sail? Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of life's wild, restless sea. And the question that Jesus has for each and every one of us is simply this: when he calls, will you heed that call and step out onto, not into, the ocean's deep? It's a choice every one of us has to make. And God bless you, Christian, for making that choice today. But we have to continue to make that choice every single waking moment. This world offers far too many options for us to wander, walk, or even just run away from the Lord. Are you going to run towards him, or are you going to run away from him? And that's a choice. That's the question. And we each have to make the answer. We're going to make that answer today. With a little luck, you'll be able to make that choice tomorrow and the next day. None of us are guaranteed any days. The choice is yours as we stand and as we sing. I am resolved no longer to linger,